In May of 1987, the Soviet Union launched into orbit the most frightening machine of the entire Cold War. 80 tons, 37 meters long, the length of a passenger jet, and painted matte black from end to end, so it would be hard to see against the dark of space. In the West, intelligence officers had a name for what they feared it was: a battle station, a weapon in orbit, carrying a laser powerful enough to blind satellites and burn them out of the sky. The newspapers would later call it the Soviet Death Star. There was just one problem with that story. The laser wasn't there. The most dangerous object the Soviet Union ever put into space was a Bluff. A giant black 80-ton Bluff, with no working weapon inside it at all. And here is the strangest part. This machine never reached orbit. It was not shot down. It was not sabotaged. America never touched it. It was told to make one simple turn in space, to roll halfway around. And instead it turned all the way around, lit its own engine, and fired itself straight back down into the Pacific Ocean. They called it Polyus. The word means pole, cold, distant, harmless. But that was a cover name painted on for the cameras. Its real name, the secret one, was Skif, after the Scythians, the ancient warriors of the steppe. This is the story of a weapon that never fired a shot, a laser that was never aboard, and the most expensive own goal in the history of the Cold War. It is also the story of how that weapon's own body would one day become the first piece of the most peaceful machine humans have ever built together. And the rocket that carried it into the sky was built by a man you have already met on this channel, the man who buried the N1. To understand how the Soviet Union ended up launching an empty weapon into the sea, you have to start with a speech. An American speech that frightened Moscow more than any bomb. Chapter 1. The speech that started a panic. On the 23rd of March 1983, the President of the United States went on television and changed the arms race. Ronald Reagan asked the American people a question that sounded almost innocent. What if nuclear missiles could be made, in his words, impotent and obsolete? What if the United States could build a shield in space that would catch Soviet missiles in mid-flight and destroy them before they ever reached an American city? He called it the Strategic Defense Initiative. The press called it something catchier: Star Wars. The idea was staggering. A web of satellites in orbit, armed with lasers and interceptors, watching for the flash of a Soviet launch and striking the missiles down as they rose through the atmosphere. Whether it could ever actually work was, and still is, an open question. Much of the technology did not exist, but that did not matter. What mattered was how it was heard, 3,000 miles away, in Moscow. To the Soviet leadership, Star Wars was not a shield. It was a threat. Think it through the way they did. If America could shoot down incoming missiles, then the balance of terror that had kept the peace for 30 years would collapse. Because a country protected by a shield could strike first and survive whatever was left of the response. In the cold logic of the nuclear age, a shield can be the most aggressive weapon of all. There was a second fear too, quieter but just as real: money. The Soviet economy was already straining. To match an American shield, the Soviets would have to spend fortunes they did not have. Some in Moscow suspected that was the whole point, that Star Wars was a trap, designed to make the Soviet Union spend itself to death. They were not entirely wrong. So the Soviet Union needed an answer, and the answer they reached for was brutally simple. If the Americans were going to fill space with weapons, then the Soviets would put weapons in space first, to destroy the American shield before it could ever be switched on. But here is the detail that almost every telling of this story gets wrong. The Soviets did not invent these weapons in answer to Reagan. Years before that television speech, back in 1976, one of the great Soviet space organizations had already begun studying battle stations for orbit. Not one design, but two. The first was called Skif, a platform carrying a powerful laser meant to hunt enemy satellites in low orbit, close to the Earth. The second was called Cascade. That one would carry guided missiles instead of a laser, reaching far higher, all the way up to the satellites in distant geostationary orbit, 36,000 kilometers out. Between them, Skif and Cascade were meant to sweep the heavens clean of anything the enemy put up there. And understand what a weapon like Skif was really for. It was not built to fight cities or armies or other nations on the ground. It was built to fight the high ground itself, the satellites. In a modern war, satellites are the eyes and the nerves of everything. They watch for launches, they guide the missiles, they carry the orders. Blind them, and a superpower goes deaf and half-blind in an instant. Whoever controlled orbit would control the war before it even began. That was the prize, and both sides knew it. For years they were only paper, studies, drawings, arguments between engineers. Too expensive, too difficult, always just out of reach. And then Reagan stood up and said the words "Star Wars" on American television. Overnight, the men who wanted to build these weapons had exactly the argument they needed. The Americans are militarizing space, they told the leadership. We cannot afford to wait. Reagan's speech did not create the Soviet space weapon, it set it free. In 1985, the order finally came. Build it. Build the first one for real. And build it fast. The job of turning that order into a flying machine went to a design bureau outside Moscow. What they were about to attempt had never been done by anyone, on Earth or above it. Chapter 2. Building the Scythian. To build a battle station, the Soviets first needed something powerful enough to lift it. And in the mid-1980s, they were finishing exactly that, the most powerful rocket they had ever made. Its name was Energia. If you have followed this channel, you already know the man behind it. Valentin Glushko, the engine designer who a decade earlier had taken control of the Soviet space program and cancelled the doomed N-1 moon rocket, the great failure of the race to the moon. The man who buried one giant rocket had spent the years since building another. Energia was a monster, able to throw roughly 100 tons toward orbit. Around its core stood 4 great strap-on boosters, driven by what were, and arguably still are, the most powerful liquid-fueled rocket engines ever built. It was the rocket the Soviet Union had dreamed of since losing the moon, and it was designed mainly to launch the Soviet space shuttle, Buran. But by 1986, there was a problem. The rocket was ready. The shuttle was not. Glushko's people wanted to fly Energia anyway, to prove it worked. But you cannot test the most powerful rocket in the world with nothing on top of it. You need a payload, something heavy, to fly the rocket the way it would really be used. And there, half built in a workshop, was the battle station. So the two programs collided. The first flight of Energia would carry the first Soviet weapon platform into space. One launch, to prove a rocket and a weapon both at once. It was a gamble stacked on top of a gamble. The bureau that built the station gave it a cold military code number, but on the hull, in white letters, they painted a different word. Polyus. Pole. A calm, scientific name for anyone watching who should not know the truth. And they went further. On the side of an 80-ton orbital weapon, the Soviets also painted the words Mir 2, hinting that it was just a piece of a future civilian space station, a peaceful laboratory. A weapon dressed in the costume of a science project. Underneath the disguise, the machine was built in 2 great pieces. The back half was the engine and control section, and it had a quiet history of its own. It came from a proven family of Soviet space tugs, vehicles that could steer, maneuver, and carry their own fuel. Remember that section. We will come back to where its bloodline ends up, and it is not anywhere you would guess. The front half was the weapon bay, long and dark, built to house the laser and the system that would aim it. The weapon itself was meant to be a carbon dioxide laser, reaching a power of 1 megawatt, from the same family of giant lasers the Soviets had already been testing in the air, aboard a modified cargo plane fitted out as a flying laboratory, built to house that. Because here is where the story turns for the first time. The laser was not ready. The weapon at the heart of the whole program was enormous, heavy, and years behind schedule. It could not be finished in time. It could not even be made to fit. So the engineers made a decision that tells you everything about the pressure they were under. They would fly the station without it. The machine that the West would soon fear as an orbital laser cannon would go into space as a shell, a full-size model. In Russian, the engineers had a blunt name for what it really was, a dynamic mock-up. It would still carry a handful of real experiments to make the flight worth something. Among them, hundreds of kilos of gas, xenon and krypton, that the station would vent into the vacuum. The official story was that this was an experiment on the upper atmosphere. The real purpose was darker and cleverer. When a giant laser fires in space, the recoil can shove the whole platform off target. Venting that gas was a test of how the weapon would one day fire without knocking itself off aim. But the laser itself? An empty bay behind a black hull. The most dangerous-looking object ever launched was, at its heart, a bluff. And the men building it were running out of time. Chapter 3. The Man with the Deadline. Every Thursday, the engineers building Polyus walked into a meeting they had learned to dread. At the head of the table sat the man in charge of the entire Soviet machine-building ministry, Oleg Baklanov, or his deputy. And week after week, the message was the same. You are behind. You are late. Move faster. The chief designer of the station, a man named Yuri Kornilov, was caught in an impossible squeeze. Above him, a ministry demanding that an 80-ton weapon be ready in well under 2 years. In front of him, a machine so new that nobody had ever built anything remotely like it. And when you push engineers that hard, something always gives. Corners get cut. Tests get shortened. Risks that should be checked twice get checked once, or not at all. And all of it happened behind a wall of secrecy so complete that many of the people working on the machine did not truly know what they were building. The cover names did their job even on the inside. Engineers worked on a component, a system, a sub-assembly, told only what they needed to know, and no more. The men who welded the hull were not necessarily the men who knew there was meant to be a laser behind it. A weapon hidden from the enemy, and in pieces, hidden even from itself. And there was one risk, buried deep in the design, that nobody had fully understood yet. To save weight and space, Polyus had to be mounted onto Energia in a strange way. Not nose up, the way you picture a payload riding a rocket. It was mounted backwards, tail forward, in effect, pointing the wrong way for what it would have to do next. And what it would have to do next was the whole problem. Energia, for all its power, was not designed to place this payload directly into orbit. The rocket would carry Polyus most of the way up, high and fast, but then let it go while the station was still moving just a little too slowly to stay in space. Left alone, it would simply arc back down. So Polyus had to finish the climb itself. After it separated from the rocket, it had to do 3 things, perfectly, automatically, in sequence. First, because it was mounted backwards, it had to flip itself around, turning 180 degrees to point its engine the right way. Then roll. Then fire that engine, hard, to push itself the final step into orbit. Flip, roll, burn. 3 moves, alone, in the dark, with no one aboard and no second chance. And here is the part the engineers understood and feared. If the flip went wrong, if the machine were pointing the wrong way when it lit that engine, then instead of pushing itself up into orbit, it would push itself down. The same engine that meant survival would become the thing that destroyed it. The control system was supposed to handle all of this on its own, flawlessly, in the few minutes after separation. But the control system, like everything else on this rushed, unfinished machine, had been built against the clock. By the spring of 1987, the Bluff was ready. 80 tons of black steel, an empty weapon bay, a service section borrowed from a space tug, and a control system carrying a flaw that not one of the men who built it had managed to find. They rolled it out to the launch pad at Baikonur, and then, just days before the launch, the most powerful man in the Soviet Union arrived to see it for himself. Chapter 4. The General Secretary at the pad. In the middle of May 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev came to Baikonur. This was not the Soviet Union of old. Gorbachev was 2 years into a revolution from the top. Perestroika, glasnost, the great opening up. He was talking openly about ending the arms race. In just a few months, he would sit across a table from Ronald Reagan and sign a treaty scrapping an entire class of nuclear missiles, one of the great arms control breakthroughs of the century. And here he was, standing in a hangar in the desert, looking up at a secret orbital battle station. The contradiction could not have been sharper. The man trying to wind down the Cold War, face to face with a weapon built to carry it into space. At the very moment Gorbachev was preparing to tell the world that the arms race must end, his own engineers were lifting that race to a place no treaty had yet reached, off the planet entirely. What happened in that hangar is one of the most debated moments in this entire story, so let me be careful with it. We know for certain that, months before, the leadership had already placed limits on this flight. The station could launch, but it was forbidden from carrying out the most provocative tests once in orbit. No deploying targets. No venting experiments that might look to a watching America like a weapon coming to life. Gorbachev did not want this thing to start an incident in space while he was trying to make peace on the ground. And then there is the account of the chief designer himself. According to Yuri Kornilov, when Gorbachev stood there at Baikonur, he went further still, and personally forbade them from testing the station's capabilities at all once it reached orbit. That comes to us from one man's memoir, so I won't hand it to you as hard fact. But it fits everything else we know. The Soviet Union was about to launch a weapon it had been ordered not to fully switch on. On the 15th of May, the countdown began, and almost immediately, the machine started to fight them. The launch was supposed to happen in the afternoon. It did not. First, a problem loading propellant cost them 8 hours, then a stubborn valve. Another hour gone. Then a fault in the flight control center itself. 2 more. The most powerful rocket on Earth sat on the pad as the entire day drained away around it. It was evening by the time they were finally ready. Darkness coming down over the steppe. Floodlights on the black machine. And then, Energia lit. The most powerful rocket the Soviet Union had ever built rose off the pad on its very first flight. And it flew, flawlessly. Every engine, every stage, exactly as designed. Glushko's machine, the redemption of the man who had buried the N1, worked perfectly, the first time it ever left the ground. High above the Earth, the rocket did its job and let the black station go. Energia had been perfect. Now everything, the years, the fortune, the bluff, the secret, came down to 3 moves, made by a machine, alone, in the dark above the planet. Flip, roll, burn. Chapter 5. The Wrong Way. Polyus separated from the rocket about 7.5 minutes into the flight, roughly 110 kilometers above the Earth. Moving fast, but by design not quite fast enough to stay in space. On its own now, the station began the sequence it had been built to perform. It started to flip, rotating to bring its engine around to the right direction for the burn that would carry it into orbit. 180 degrees. That was all it had to turn. Halfway around. Then stop. It did not stop. Deep in the control logic there was a flaw. The exact kind of flaw that hides inside a machine built too fast. At around 9.5 minutes into the flight, a single command was sent to open the covers on the weapon bay. But that exact command, by mistake, was the very same instruction that had earlier been used to switch off the thrusters, whose job was to stop the rotation. In the act of opening its own hatches, the station switched off its own ability to stop turning. So it kept turning, past 180 degrees, past the point where it should have halted and held steady, all the way around, 360 degrees, back to facing exactly the way it had started, the wrong way. And then, right on schedule, obedient, precise, doing exactly what it was told, the engine fired. But the station was now pointing backwards, so the engine that was meant to push it up into orbit pushed it the other way instead. It fired itself down toward the Earth. There was no explosion, no enemy, no dramatic battle among the stars. Just an 80-ton machine performing its task to perfection in precisely the wrong direction. Minutes later, the most feared weapon of the late Cold War came back down through the atmosphere and broke apart over the Pacific Ocean. It had never reached orbit. It had never carried a working laser. And it was destroyed, not by America, not by any enemy at all, but by a single confused line in its own instructions. There was no fireball for anyone to see. The truth arrived the way most truths do in spaceflight, quietly, in the numbers. On the screens in the control center, the data came back wrong. The wrong attitude, the wrong velocity, an orbit that was never going to close. No triumphant blip settling into a stable path around the Earth. Just a curve, bending back down. Somewhere in those minutes, the engineers reading the telemetry understood that the thing they had bled for was already falling into the sea. The rocket beneath it had been flawless. The weapon on top of it had killed itself in under 10 minutes. In Moscow, the official news agency made a short announcement. A large satellite had failed to reach orbit. They did not mention a weapon. They did not mention a laser. They did not mention that the Soviet Union had just spent years, and a fortune it did not have, launching a battle station straight into the sea. Chapter 6. The Afterlife of a Weapon. The failure of Polyus did not just lose a spacecraft. It lost an argument. Inside the Soviet leadership, there had always been people who thought these orbital weapons were a ruinous waste, wildly expensive, perhaps technically impossible, and exactly the kind of military spending Gorbachev was fighting to cut. As long as the program might still work, those voices could be overruled. But now the first station had flown and driven itself straight into the ocean in front of everyone who mattered. That was all its opponents needed. The plan to build a second station, the one that would have carried the real laser, was abandoned. The whole family of battle stations, Skif and Cascade both, was wound down. The Soviet Union never put a weapon platform into orbit again, and within 4 years, the country that had built it was gone. But the story does not end with wreckage on the seabed. Remember the back half of the machine, the engine and control section, the one I told you to keep in mind. Its design did not die with the rest. That same family of space tugs, the proven section that steered and powered Polyus, carried on. Its bloodline ran through the modules of the Mir space station, and then, in 1998, it became something almost unthinkable. When the United States and Russia, the two old enemies, finally began building the International Space Station together, the very first piece launched into orbit was a module called Zarya. It went up in November of 1998. Built in the same Russian workshops, from the same engineering lineage as the service section of a Soviet orbital weapon, and, in one final twist, paid for by the United States. Zarya means dawn. Think about that for a moment. The engineering born to help destroy American satellites in orbit became the foundation stone of the greatest act of cooperation in the history of spaceflight. A weapon's bloodline turned into a home shared by the very people it was designed to fight. And yet, the dream that created Polyus never really died. In recent years, it has come roaring back. In 2024, American intelligence warned that Russia was developing a new space-based nuclear weapon. Not a precise laser this time, but something far cruder. A nuclear device that, detonated in orbit, could cripple satellites across whole swathes of space at once. Weeks later, at the United Nations, Russia vetoed a resolution meant simply to reaffirm that nuclear weapons should never be placed in orbit at all. And in 2025, the United States announced its own answer, a vast missile shield reaching up into space itself, with interceptors waiting in orbit. They called it the Golden Dome. Reagan's old dream, the very dream that frightened the Soviets into building Polyus, 40 years on, reborn. Once again, the great powers are reaching for weapons in the sky, and the lesson of Polyus is still up there, waiting for them. The machine never fired a shot. It only had to make one turn, and it got it wrong. The most dangerous weapon the Soviet Union ever launched carried no working weapon at all. It was stopped by no enemy. It was undone by its own hand. In under 10 minutes, 80 tons of ambition turning the wrong way in the dark. We have now followed three giants of the Soviet space age: the N-1 that exploded on the pad, the Buran shuttle that flew once, perfectly, and was forgotten, and the battle station that destroyed itself. Three machines, brilliant and doomed, built by an empire that kept reaching for the stars long after it could no longer afford the climb. If you want to see where this story began, with the rocket that was meant to win the moon and tore itself apart instead, watch the N-1 episode next. The man who buried it is the same man who built the rocket you saw tonight. I'm Iron Curtain Industries. Thank you for